In today's video, we're going to take a look at a product that I've been wanting to look at for quite a while, and that's this projector from Xiaomi. And just before we get started, I'd like to say a massive thank you to AliExpress for sending this over to review. And just because I'm always very clear with any videos like this, AliExpress did send me this free of charge to take a look at, although I did actually pick the projector. I could have picked from anything on the site, and I really wanted to take a look at this. And they're not giving me anything to say, but if you're interested in buying this, there's links in the description and in a pinned comment as well. But yeah, this is one of Xiaomi's portable projectors. And this particular model is only really available on the Chinese market, and it's called the Youth 2. And I've really wanted to take a look at it because it's quite a promising option. It's only £350, although prices do tend to vary as based on demand and stuff, but about £350. And it is really, really competitive with a lot of other portable projectors round about that price point. But the specs are often a little bit better. So I'm really interested to try it out. So yeah, as you can see, this is very much a portable projector. You know, it's not designed for big meeting rooms. It's not a big thing with a big lamp in it or anything like that. It's more designed for things like home movies and stuff like that. Something very small you can take around with you, set up very easily, and watch a movie on. And for that, it's got a lot of very useful features we'll take a look at. Now, what makes this very promising around this price point is the specs. This is a full 1080p DLP chip. A lot of other projectors around about this price point, especially in the portable market like this, only have like 720p DLP chips, maybe even lower, and they'll accept a 4K input or a 1080p input, but they'll only have that tiny low resolution chip, whereas this has a full native 1080p resolution. And then in terms of brightness, this has a brightness of 460 ANSI lumens. Now again, that's not huge compared to the sort of business projectors you'd have in meeting rooms, but for a small LED projector about this size, that's really good. At this price point, you're kind of comparing to things like the Anchor Nebula, which is only about 100 to 200 ANSI lumens. So for 460, that is a lot brighter. And one word about ANSI lumens as well, is if you're looking at projectors, especially cheap generic ones, the key thing is ANSI lumens are different from a number of just lumens. ANSI lumens are sort of measured on a standardized scale, so you can compare between projectors. Some cheaper projectors just tend to give a value for lumens, which is they call it like the total output of the LED itself, and it's not a standardized way of measuring it. And they use it to come up with crazy numbers. You'll see projectors with 10,000 lumens, which just is not a thing outside of, you know, cinema projectors. So on the ANSI lumen scale, 460 is pretty good for a small LED projector like this. And we'll take a look at it in practice and talk about where the brightness is suitable and where it's not. So first of all, let's take a look at what we get. So here we have the box. Now the box is entirely in Chinese, so there's not really much point showing you it. I suspect that's the 2 from Youth 2, but I have no idea what else this means, but it's a projector, it's easy enough to figure out. So all you really get is very simple. You get a projector, a remote, and a power brick. And obviously because it's international, it's a US plug on the power brick, but it is multi-voltage, it's 100 to 240 volts, so I can easily use that in the UK. The only thing I would say is it did include a big Clive style depth adapter. If you buy a product and it comes with one of these cheap unfused adapters, throw them away, don't use them, and I'm just going to literally fling that down the hall because don't use those because they're not fused, they're not safe to use in the UK, especially because our ring circuits require a fuse in the plug. So yeah, you want to use a proper adapter, but I'm just going to use one of these, just a decent master plug adapter with a fuse in it. So yeah, no problem there at all. And it is just a 19 volt, 3.42 amp power brick, so you can even replace that with a different one if you needed to, but yeah, I'll just use that adapter for now. That's perfectly safe to use. And then we've got the projector itself. So we take a look at it. It's a very small, lightweight projector. It's a slightly weird shape because it's quite boxy, but you'll see why, and it's because it's got a built-in speaker that's actually quite good. And it's quite a nice little form factor. You can easily stand that on a table, and it'll project quite a decent image. And it's small enough that you can quite easily take this with you. You know, you could fit that in a rucksack, or I can even imagine, say, going on holiday, just throwing this in my suitcase and just, you know, being on holiday and being able to whip out and have a movie in a hotel room. You know, it's just quite a nice sort of small portable thing to have. On the front, you can see it's got this nice sort of fabric finish. It's actually a very, very nice finish. You've got a lens, and you've got a little camera here that says 1080p AF. And this is a really cool feature with this that I was a bit skeptical about at first, but it actually works really well. And that is that it has autofocus. So what you do is you set it up, the projector will display a test pattern, the camera will then view that test pattern, and it'll autofocus. And basically I've had it work without fail. I've not had this, the only time I've ever had a problem with it is if I've stupidly got my head in the way of the sensor. Basically every time I've tried it, it's worked really well. And it even has like automatic 4D Keystone adjustment we'll take a look at. So yeah, really good having that. And it just makes it super easy to work with. Especially if you're buying a projector for someone who's not technical, who's not used to using projectors. Having a projector that you can just literally set down, switch on, and it'll set itself up is so useful. You don't have to explain to someone how to do manual Keystone adjustment, so yeah, it's really good. Big grills on the sides, these are generally like air intake. On the top, you've got a couple of, I think there's microphones, potentially. It's got sort of voice recognition, so it's potentially for that. And then a power switch. Around the back, you've got a fan grill that I think also might be a speaker grill, and then all the inputs and outputs down the bottom. So there's not much in terms of inputs and outputs because it is a small basic projector. You've just got a DC input, a 3.5mm headphone jack for audio output, a USB port which you can either use to power things or to put a stick in with media on it and watch media off it, and an HDMI port. And the good thing with this HDMI port is it's HDMI 2.0 and supports 4K. Now, that does not mean it's a 4K projector, but what it does mean is you can feed it a 4K source and it will correctly display it. Now, lots of people will be like, oh, why do you do that? That can be useful in certain situations. For example, my AV setup here is normally connected to a 4K TV, and my AV receiver has 2 HDMI outputs. Being able to just plug it into this projector and have the AV receiver potentially output 4K to this and just have this work is so useful. Because with previous projectors that only take 1080p inputs, I've had issues where the receiver still tries to output 4K because it thinks it's talking to the TV, or maybe you've got a PC that's got a fixed resolution or something like that, and then you have issues. With this, just having the versatility of being able to plug into a HDMI switch or a receiver with multiple outputs, a satellite box with a fixed 4K resolution or whatever, and have this just be able to display it without having to change settings is really, really useful. But yeah, that's the device. And then finally on the bottom, you've got 4 rubber feet and a tripod screw. So you can either mount this on a tripod or you can ceiling mount it. And I've come up with quite a neat way of ceiling mounting this, so we'll take a look at that. But I've also tried it out on a tripod and it works absolutely fine. So even a cheap little camera tripod, a lighting stand that's got a tripod screw thread, anything like that, you can mount it on. And it weighs so little that it's super easy to mount. And because the screw is centred and it's quite balanced weight-wise around the centre, you don't have any issues with it hanging off or bending in weird ways, so it's really easy to mount. So yeah, that's the projector. Final thing to take a look at is the remote, just before we go and turn it on. And that's the remote there. It's very simple. You've just got a power button, a microphone button, which, again, voice activation, I don't really use it, direction pad, a few buttons, volume up, down. It's very basic, and I think there's a little microphone on top. The remote's very, very basic, but one thing that was actually quite surprising with this that I really like is it's an RF remote. It's not infrared, which is really useful because a lot of projectors do still use infrared remotes, and sometimes you've got the projector behind you mounted on the ceiling, you've got to like reach over and point the remote towards it. With this, because it's an RF remote, realistically you can just point it anywhere, which is quite a nice little touch. Didn't really expect it to have that, but yeah, that was Bluetooth. It's got a Bluetooth logo on the back. Kind of cool. But yeah, nice little remote there. It actually feels decently built. It feels like a nicely built device. It definitely doesn't feel like a cheap projector. It feels reasonably premium, which is good. So yeah, that's a tour of the outside of it. What we'll now do is we'll go and turn it on, take a first look at it all working, and then I'll go through to the living room and get it all set up. Okay, so I've now got it plugged into power, so let's turn it on. So, button on the top, or we can use the remote. I'll turn it on. And if we pan the camera up, we can take a look at it. There you go. And because it's an LED projector, it comes on really pretty quickly. Now, obviously, we're very close to the wall there, so it's not going to be the biggest image in the world. And obviously, it's under studio lighting, so it's not going to look super bright. But yeah, we've got an image there. Now, one thing I would say is you will see a rolling effect on the camera. This is not visible in real life. It's a common thing with DLP projectors, where you've essentially got either a colour wheel, where there's a little wheel that rotates in front of the chip to cycle through different colours, or potentially like an RGB LED that's flashing different colours. Essentially, with a DLP projector, it paints each colour on the screen individually and just basically very quickly flashes different colours. You cannot see that in person, but just on camera it kind of picks up that sort of rolling effect, but in person you don't see that at all. This is common across all DLP projectors. But yeah, there's the image. Okay, so there we go, that's up and running, and I've adjusted the shutter speed of the camera so you can't see the rolling now. It's just very much a camera effect. But that's it working. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that this is very much a smart device, but it is also running Chinese firmware. So it starts up to this like smart streaming service for China that I don't understand. So none of this really works, but yeah, it has all that. Now, this does actually run Android, so you can run Android apps on it. However, because it's a Chinese device, it doesn't support the Google Play Store or Google Play services. So it means if you're installing apps, you are going to be a bit limited. I tried installing a few on here to see what I could get working. Didn't have that much luck. So I was able to install this app here, which is Aptoid TV. It's like a Android TV compatible app store, sort of third-party app store. Through that, I was able to install this smart YouTube app. This works fine, and it'll happily play YouTube off the device. But the official YouTube app doesn't work because it requires Google Play services. Likewise, I tried things like Amazon Prime TV. That didn't work. It just threw up playback errors. Puffin TV, that's a web browser. That does work, and I was able to play things like Prime Video through browser. But essentially, even though it is a smart device, I just wouldn't expect to use really the smart functionality on this outside of China. It's just a bit too limited because it doesn't have Google Play services. But that's fine. I knew that before I got it anyway. I knew I wasn't going to really be using the smart devices or smart functionality. But I just thought it's worth mentioning for people who might be looking for that yeah, don't really expect the smart stuff on this to work well outside of China. But bear in mind this device is also only £350. You could buy a £20, £30 smart stick, a little Fire Stick or something like that, plug that into the back, HDMI, USB to power it, and it'll work perfectly fine. So it's not really a big deal. So now before we go away and set it up in the living room and actually test it out properly on a big screen, I want to show the autofocus stuff this has, because it's actually really cool. So as you can see, we've currently got a perfectly in focus image, but if I move the projector further forward, you'll see it'll show this little test pattern. It'll adjust the focus, you'll see it sort of hunting in and out, and then once it's happy with it, it'll set it and give you a perfectly sharp image. Likewise, even if I hold the projector miles back from the wall, even using it handheld, you can see it's doing the test there, just in focus. And there you go, perfectly in focus again. So the autofocus is actually really, really reliable. It works really well. What you'll also find is that as standard, it'll also do vertical keystone adjustment using an accelerometer built into the projector. So if you tilt it down, you'll see it's kind of going to adjust and just square the image up automatically using the built-in accelerometer. So that combined with the autofocus works really well. Now obviously with any sort of digital keystone adjustment, you will lose resolution. That's just how it works. It's manually cropping the image and adjusting the shape of it. So ideally you want to have it facing straight on, but sometimes that's simply not possible in certain environments, and in which case having that functionality is really good, and having it automatic makes it even better. Now one feature that's got that's even cooler than that though, is full omnidirectional keystone support, and that's automatic using the camera. So you can go into the image settings, go down here and turn that on, enable that, and now we can see how this works. So previously it would only do vertical keystone. What this will now do is it can now let you place the camera the projector off to the side of the screen. So if I place it there, for example, you'll see the image is very skewed out of shape. It shows that new test pattern, it's different to the previous one. It adjusts, and then it'll square the image off. And it'll actually do a pretty good job, up to even fairly extreme angles. So that might be too much for it. But even fairly extreme angles, it can actually correct. Yep, there you go. And you can see how far off axis this projector is, yet it's still giving a perfectly square image. Now, obviously at this point you have lost quite a lot of resolution because you're cropping the DLP chip down to that much smaller size. But in a pinch, if you're in a situation where the projector has to sit off to the side, just based on where people are sitting in a room or whatever, this can be extremely useful. And just having it all automatic makes life so much easier. You simply just move it, let it adjust, and then you get a perfectly square image every time. Now the only one downside I would say with this is that when you've got it enabled, it will always kind of keep doing it. So even in a situation like this, where the projector is fairly straight onto the screen, there's no real requirement to have any sort of keystone adjustment in this particular situation, it still has adjusted it a tiny little bit, which means it's cropped the image to be a little bit smaller than it has to be. So essentially all that means is the picture might be a little bit smaller than it has to be, so you kind of have to move the projector further back, and when you move it further back, the picture gets darker because it's further from the wall. So what I would do is, if you need that enabled, definitely enable it. But if you don't need it enabled, it's probably worth turning it off unless you are using it off axis, because with that disabled, you'll get a bigger image. So I've disabled it there, and then what you need to do is reset it to kind of get the full-size image. And you'll see here, if I reset it, the picture will grow slightly. You might not have seen that because it's on a wall with no scale, but at least when I was testing it in the living room, that did make the image slightly bigger. So yeah, really useful feature to have if you need it. But if you're not using it, it's probably worth turning it off just to get that full-size image. The automatic vertical correction is fine though. You can leave that enabled. Although again, if you find that that's, you don't really need it or whatever, you could turn that off. But yeah, the auto setup on this is extremely useful. It's so much easier than trying to manually focus a projector, then walk over to the screen, look at it, go, oh, is that correct? Go back, manually adjust it again. And then someone happens to move the projector and then you've got to go and manually do it. This is just totally just plug and play. Just shift it, it just fixes itself. So it's great for less technical people as well to use. I'll say that. I think actually, yeah, the tablecloth bumped in front of the camera there. Just like that. There you go. And it works super reliably. So yeah, I'm very happy with how well that works with the autofocus. So now before I go and set this up in the living room, the only other thing that's worth mentioning is the angle of projection that comes out of this. With projectors, you generally get two types, and I can't remember the terminology, but essentially you get ones where the beam comes out the lens and the lens is like centered on the image, so it projects out sort of, so the projector is sitting vertically within the image in the middle of it. And then you get ones like this that kind of project the image up slightly. So you'll see the projector sitting on the table and projecting onto the wall, where the base of the image, the bottom line of the image, is kind of in line with the lens, and the rest of the image is projected above the lens. This projector is obviously that type. So it means if you sit on a table like this, the image will be projected slightly higher than the projector, which is good for probably the vast majority of situations you'd be using a projector like this in. But you can sit it on a coffee table, sit it in front of you, and it'll project correctly. If it projected sort of centered on the image, the downside with that is if you had the projector sitting in front of you, the projector would have to literally sit in front of you. It would be at eye level, it would be right in the middle of the image and it would get in the way. So being able to put the projector lower down and have it project up is really good. The only time you might need to be careful with it is if you're going to put the projector behind you. Because if you're putting the projector behind you, you might have issues potentially if you wanted to sit in front of it. Because if your screen's relatively low down, you end up with your head potentially getting into the image. So it's just worth bearing in mind, but you can usually work around it if you have to do that. So what we'll do now is we're going to take a look at my setup in the living room to see how I've installed it. And here we go, this is how I've mounted it. So yep, I've actually ceiling mounted it this time. And that's because of what I was saying about the angle of projection. With this mounted on the ceiling, it means I can have it really high up close to the ceiling and out of the way and get a perfectly projected image on the wall. Whereas if I had it sitting down on the floor, like on a stand like I used to with the old one, it ended up being a case that my head would get in the way if I was sitting on the couch. It was fine on my own because I could kind of sit in the corner out the way, but if there's multiple people sitting on the couch, you all sit along it and then your head kind of starts popping up into the picture. So putting it on the ceiling was really good, just get it out of the way. And because it's so light, it's really easy to mount. And I came up with a system that I'm quite proud of. Now, because it has a camera tripod screw on the bottom, it meant I could mount it using standard camera hardware. So what I ended up doing was getting a camera sort of tripod ball joint thing, attaching that to the projector, and putting a cold shoe mount on the bottom of it. So it could just mount onto like a camera cold shoe. I could have mounted it at the top of my camcorder if I wanted. But what I then did was got a tripod cold shoe and screwed it to the ceiling. So dead simple, that just sits up on the ceiling. And all I did to mount that was just use a simple, spring drywall or plasterboard spring toggle, put it through the cold shoe, drill an 8mm hole in the ceiling, and fit it up there. It's not going to hold a huge amount of weight, but the spring toggle is rated for 10 kilograms according to the Screwfix website, and this weighs barely anything, so that's perfectly fine. And what it means, when the projector's up there, it mounts really neatly. It's fully adjustable, although actually it sits basically straight on, it's the perfect size. But what it then means is if I take the projector down in the future, because I don't leave it up here, the cable kind of just trails over there, I only have it here temporarily when I'm using it, I just need to unhook it from the cold shoe and just leave the cold shoe sitting on the ceiling. It is black, so it is a little bit visible, but I might see if I can either get a white one or potentially paint it, but if I paint it, it'll probably rub off when I try and use it. But realistically, having a tiny little black cold tube mounted on the ceiling really isn't a problem. It doesn't really look much worse than, like, say, stainless steel downlights. So yeah, I'm very proud of that mounting mechanism. It's great because I can just temporarily put it up there, pull it down really easily, and it gives plenty of clearance so I can get to the kitchen door, because that was the issue with the other projector sitting on a stand, is I did trip over the cable and throw it off the stand, which amazingly survived. So yeah, very pleased with the ceiling mount. And what that then means, if we pan around here, we can see the screen. So there we go. That's projecting the big image. And I measured the screen. This is currently about 117 inches. So it's right towards the maximum you'd get from a projector like this. And it's really pretty good. And this is just using a very cheap, just stretched out, screen that I've just attached on some command hooks on the ceiling and attached onto the furniture at the sides there. So dead cheap setup that's easy to set up. Now what you'll notice here though is the one downside of a relatively low brightness LED projector. And that is, in a lit room, it's not a very bright image. So that means you wouldn't want to use a projector like this, or really any projector of this sort of class, in, say, a meeting room. In meeting rooms, you're going to have the lights on in the room so you can see each other, and then you're going to want to see the screen. A 500 ANSI lumen projector, 460 ANSI lumen projector just isn't bright enough for that. But if you can watch it in a dark room, which realistically you'll be doing if you're watching movies, turn the lights off, and you actually get a perfectly bright image out of it. It actually looks really, really good. Again, it's flickering a little bit with that DLP effect, but what you can see there is actually a very perfectly bright image. Now, it's not bright to the level of, like, there being an explosion in a movie and the whole room lighting up as like a super dramatic, wow, massive brightness sort of thing. But it's perfectly bright to watch content, and it's still impressive. And realistic with projectors, generally you're going for just big screen over sort of super dynamic range and stuff like that. It's just a sort of big screen sort of wow factor. But yeah, that's the sort of image projection on the wall. So what we'll now do is we'll go in closer and take a look at how it all works and talk about, well, the overall picture quality. Okay, so here we are back with it all up and running, now connected to the computer. So my AV receiver is now connected into it with HDMI, and the Mac Mini is outputting a signal to it. And I've tested that I could set the AV receiver to output 4K, and the projector happily handled that, so that's really good. But we're now sending a 1080p signal just so everything's getting the native resolution for the best possible image. And as you can see, it's pretty good. One of the main things I've noticed, especially over the previous projector I looked at, which was much lower end, is that the focus is a lot better. It's got much better optics. It's still not perfect in that it does slightly go less focused in the corner, but it's not bad. You can see up there where it says Safari, it's still focused enough, it's still sharp enough. Same if we walk over here, walking right in front of the projector, you can again see up there, the time is again fairly in focus. With some really cheap lenses, it ends up being in focus in the middle of the screen and then totally blurred in the corners. Whereas with this, it's not too bad. The whole screen is reasonably uniform focus. Now, being a DLP projector, you do somewhat get a screen door effect where you kind of see the individual lines for the pixels, but it's not too bad. It's actually a lot better than a lot of other DLP projectors I've used. I think also partially because it's fairly high resolution at 1080p. So you might make it out a little bit on camera, but it's not bad at all. Now, the one thing I have noticed, however, is it does have slight fringing, like coloured fringing. So you can see here where there's like the border of a bit of an image, you see a little bit pink. Around the text, you kind of see a little bit pink below and a little bit green above. That is quite common, and it's just a downside of a relatively low cost small projector. They have to cut corners to make something so small, so you do get that slight colour fringing. Now that again comes back to the sort of use of this projector. You're only going to really notice this sort of effect when you're displaying things like a computer screen with text on it. And as I've mentioned, it's not really the sort of projector you'd want to use for things like, presentations. It's not bright enough for that. But if you're watching, say, movie content or videos, you're not going to notice that sort of effect as much. I mean, even here looking at this image, for example, you can't see any of those effects on the image. It's only really something you're going to see on things like text or computer graphics. So overall, I'm very happy with the image. And I was somewhat concerned about the brightness because obviously the previous projector I made a video of was apparently 7,000 lumens, which even at the start I knew was a totally made up value. But it meant I didn't know how bright that actually was. But realistically looking at this doesn't look much dimmer. It probably looks around about the same. So yeah, turns out a 500 ANSI lumen projector, or 460 ANSI lumens, is actually perfectly good to make a, 120-ish odd inch screen. Just you need to have the room very dark to do it. So as long as you can turn all the lights off, this is a perfectly viable projector. And sure, it's not maybe as bright as, a full-size projector. Having something so small and portable that I can just mount up there off a single plasterboard spring toggle, and it's also extremely portable, is absolutely ideal. And then that's like I can just chuck in a suitcase to take on holiday if I want to travel with it. So yeah, very happy with it. The image quality is pretty good. You just have that slight colour fringing. So what I'll now do is we'll take a quick look at watching some video on it. Again, you're not going to be able to judge the quality, through a camera because, it's just impossible to judge. But I'll show some video content, then we'll talk about it. Okay, so now here we are looking at some of the finest royalty-free footage I could find. And the picture quality is really good. So yeah, when you're watching any sort of media content, video, stuff like that, it's absolutely brilliant. Sure, you're not maybe going to get the same as buying a £1,000 4K top-end projector, but for such a small device, the picture quality is really, really impressive. Ideally when the video loops, there we go. So yeah, it's pretty good. Now, I did go and tweak a couple of the settings, so you can do that by pressing the menu button when you're doing this, when you're viewing a video, and it brings up this sort of quick menu at the top. All I really tweaked in here was these original modes. It comes with this sort of standard mode, which to me feels too sharpened. It's got a sharpening adjustment, and it's just a little bit too intense, so edges look a little bit too sharp. There's a few other modes. Movie mode also is a bit too sharp, but it's a bit warmer. The standard mode is quite a cool colour temperature and just felt a bit harsh. So movie mode is quite good as a preset. Showy mode oversaturates the colours. It's this classic shop mode you'd get on a TV. But what I ended up doing was doing a custom mode, where basically all I did was increase the brightness slightly, decrease the sharpness, which is the big one, because that meant it felt a lot less over-sharpened. The edges didn't feel as overly defined. And I changed the colour temperature to colour warm, whereas I think it was colour standard, I think. Standard felt a bit too greeny, so setting that to warm really helped. So with those changes there, I'm very happy with the picture quality. So yeah, it doesn't require much effort to get a really good picture out of it. So yeah, picture quality is actually really, really good, especially for the price point, because for £350, this is pretty impressive. So let's look at the picture quality. But another thing with this projector is that it has a very good built-in speaker. And that's very useful for a device like this, because even though here I've got it connected to a big AV receiver, if you're traveling or you're just, say, a small home user, you're using this in a bedroom, taking it on holiday, something like that, you don't want to have to take big speakers with you. And the number of times I've ended up watching a film on like a office-style projector, like when I was in uni and stuff, and you're using the projector's built-in speakers, and they're just dreadful. Whereas this one, they're actually pretty serviceable. They're not hi-fi, they're not the most amazing thing in the world, but they are fairly usable. So let's do a quick test now, just to let you hear the sound quality. So as you probably heard there, the speakers are pretty good. So that was with some music, and yeah, they've got a decent amount of bass, and they've also got a decent amount of high end, which is good. It's not just all booming bass. It's maybe a bit more sibilant than I'd like. The sort of high end S-type sounds can be a little bit harsh, but it's pretty good. What we'll do now as a final test is I'll just put one of my other videos on just so you can hear the audio of just like speech through it, and it's also pretty good. In today's video, we're going to do something that I've been meaning to do for quite a while, and that is a teardown of the Unify UDM Pro. I bought this a good few months ago, in fact, probably more than 6 months ago, and I've been using it as my router ever since. And it's really good. I'm definitely very happy with it. And when I got it, I kept meaning to do a teardown just to see what's inside. So yeah, that was some speech quality, and again, it's pretty serviceable. Obviously, if you can use better speakers, then do that, but if you're in a pinch and you've only got the speakers built into this, they're going to work perfectly fine. And the other thing that's quite impressive is how quiet it is. With the previous cheap projector I looked at, the fans were really, really loud. And then even on a lot of normal projectors, they're quite loud. This one does have fan noise, there's no getting around it, there is a fan in it. But, you know, I can just about hear it right now. And as soon as you play any sound, you don't actually hear the fan noise kind of just gets muted under the sound. So yeah, it's also really quiet, which is good. Not silent, but definitely one of the quieter projectors I've used. So there you go. That was a look at the Xiaomi Youth 2 projector. And as you can tell, I'm very happy with it. Sure, it's not going to sort of project perfectly in a bright conference room, but if you're looking for something that works for a home environment, you know, where you can turn the lights off, watch a movie, and you want something quite compact that you can easily store or travel with, this thing's ideal. And at only £350, this is really competitive against other projectors in this price point. Realistic with other sort of portable projectors like this, all the ones around about this price are going to be lower resolution or lower brightness. So it is a very, very promising option. The only thing to bear in mind is just that the smart stuff doesn't really work outside of China. So if you're planning on using this in another country, you really need to either rely on HDMI inputs from other sources or some sort of smart stick, something like that. But that's kind of fine. That's what I was planning on doing anyway, and I kind of knew that was the case in advance. Even the listing did state that it doesn't have Google Play services. So yeah, definitely very happy with it. I'm also very pleased with my little mounting mechanism up there. That was quite fun. So yeah, there you go. Thank you very much for watching. And if you're interested in buying this, there's links in the description.